Hello there. Welcome to Just the Discs. We talk about Blu-rays here, and I am very honored today to have a very special guest joining me. Filmmaker Adam Rifkin is joining me to talk about a very special release. Hello, Adam.
Hello, happy to be here. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure to have you. So what I have here is a release from Dekanalog, one of the Vinegar Syndrome partner labels, and it is called the Adam Rifkin Film Festival. And I just wondered if you could tell my listeners and viewers what this set is and how it came about.
Sure. Well, the Adam Rifkin Film Festival is a collection of all of the Super 8 movies that I made when I was a child growing up in the Chicago area with my dad's Sears Super 8 camera. There's also some couple of things that were shot on video on there too, but this is basically just a collection of my childhood films that I made. When I was a kid, all I ever wanted to do was make movies. I always knew I was going to move out to Hollywood when I got old enough and learn how to make real movies and pursue making real movies. But I spent my childhood making these little films with my friends just because it was fun and I loved doing it. And I didn't realize at the time, because I was just doing it because I loved it, I was actually teaching myself the basic principles of how movies are made. And so by the time I actually did get out to Los Angeles, I started to see how real movies were being made. I realized, wow, I've done some of the legwork already to know how some of this stuff works. But so the way that this came about, and by the way, these movies were made from the time I was 6 years old, roughly, till about 19. So all through my youth. And the way it came about was, so Vinegar Syndrome has put out two of the films that I directed under my Grindhouse nom de plume, which is Riff Coogan. I've made some exploitation movies under the name Riff Coogan. And I did that just because I thought would be fun to have a exploitation persona to make, low budget fun grindhouse movies on the side. And Vinegar Syndrome put out these two movies. One of them was called Psycho Cop 2. That's the first one they put out. And then the next one that they put out was called The Invisible Maniac. And Vinegar Syndrome does beautiful packaging and they load their discs with fantastic extras. And they made, for both movies, really comprehensive making of documentaries about both movies. So Elijah Drenner, who worked on both of those releases, creating the supplemental material, making the documentaries, editing them together. When he was doing my interview for the Invisible Maniac making of documentary, it came up in one of the questions he asked me, this idea that when I was a kid, I made tons of little movies with my dad's home movie camera. So after the interview was done, he said, "Do you still have those movies?" I said, "I still have a bunch of them, I think, in storage somewhere on Super 8 reels." He said, "Wouldn't it be cool if we could find them, digitize them, and put them out in a collection? And this could be sort of the first in a series of filmmakers who we could maybe release some of their early films." I said, "I love the idea and I'd be honored to be the first one." So I dug all the films out of boxes that I could find, and Elijah had them all digitized. They've never looked this good. And it was great because to me, the whole idea was so surreal that these films that I made as a little kid, never ever anticipating that they would ever be seen by anyone beyond the few friends that would gather around in the backyard when I would show them on a sheet, with our Super 8 projector. He really took this project very seriously. He compiled them beautifully. He restored them beautifully. He put description cards before each one. The disc is loaded with extras. He interviewed members of my family and friends that I haven't talked to in 40 years, 45 years. And it's just an incredibly, I mean, he got Bob Fingerman, who's a famous comic book and graphic novel artist and writer, to create the cover art. And he just did a really, really beautiful job putting this collection together. And if nothing else, if nobody buys a one, I'm delighted that these are all now preserved on glorious Blu-ray for my posterity. But I hope they sell a lot, just because I think it's fun that it's out there. But it's just really neat that these movies are all being saved in this beautiful way, you know.
Yeah, no, it's a really delightful collection, and there's a great youthful exuberance that you have in the filmmaking.
Thank you.
Before I talk about your inspirations, it's kind of divided into two sections. It's like when you're living at home, and then when you go off to school. Can you talk about the separation between those two sections?
Yeah. So the first series of films are from when I was genuinely a little kid, living at home, making them in our backyard. And the suburb that I was living in at that time was called Arlington Heights, which is outside of downtown Chicago. But I went to high school in downtown Chicago, and I had to take a train to the high school I went to. Chicago has a performing and visual arts high school called the Chicago Academy of the Arts, and I went to that high school. In their art, I was an art major, but I used film as my medium of choice, and so all of my projects were films, all of my art projects. So you see the second half of the films are a new group of friends, a new environment, and so that's why there's sort of a delineation between the little kid films at home with the kids in the neighborhood, and then downtown high school films with the friends from high school. There is a third sort of bit as well. The last film on the collection is a film I made out here. When I was 19, I had an opportunity to direct my first feature, but before they would green light it, they wanted to make sure that I could direct. So they gave me a few $1,000s. I don't remember exactly, 3,000, 5,000. I don't remember exactly what it was, to make a short film as a calling card, really, as a sort of a proof of concept that if they gave me money to direct a movie, I could do it. So the final film on the collection, which is called Purvis Proves His Worth, was made out here with a new group of people. And then that movie is what enabled me to get my first feature actually made. And so from that point forward, I was making features.
Very nice. I forgot about that third segment. That's very cool. I noticed that there's some actors, I think more in the high school years, that you then continued to work with, I feel like, even into your professional filmmaking days. Am I correct?
And still to this day.
Nice.
So Miles Dougal, who I went to high school with in Chicago, he was in a bunch of my high school films and has been in most of my current films, and is even in, most recently, the film I'm finishing now, which is called Last Train to Fortune. He's been in, yeah, most of my movies. Tom Hodges, who was in some of my films in high school, he and I are still very close, and he's been in films of mine of late. And Adam Bitterman is another actor who I went to high school with. He's been in films of mine as an adult. And yeah, it's been fun that us all keeping in touch and still working together and making movies and stuff.
Yeah, that's really cool. I just thought that was a neat, connective tissue, and, just really kind of showed how much affection you had for the filmmaking. And I think how probably much affection in terms of the process that you had, that you continued these relationships with these people. I think that's really neat.
Thank you.
But okay, so let's go back to the beginning here. What were some of the early inspirations for some of your earliest movies? Like what inspired you to make these, and what were you kind of, riffing on, I guess, if anything?
Well, oops, I just kicked the plug out of my computer. Hold on. I don't want it to, there we go. Thank God. Crisis averted. So I always loved movies. Always. My earliest memory that sort of kick-started that love of movies was when I kid you not, I was probably 4, maybe 5. my grandfather bought me an issue of Famous Monsters magazine, which was a popular magazine at the time, that basically just was about, it was just articles about classic horror movies, current monster movies, all about, just the horror genre. Great photographs, stories about the behind the scenes, interviews with people who made movies. So that when he bought me that was revelatory. And he also bought me an Aurora model kit of a Dracula model. So those two things combined, he bought them for me at the same time. The Famous Monsters magazine, the Dracula model, just really the pictures in Famous Monsters just really excited me. All these photographs of these cool monsters and stuff. And at the same time, growing up in Chicago, in those days, local television programming was a big thing. It doesn't really exist the same way anymore. But in those days, all the major markets had national television shows playing on their channels, but they also had local television stations creating programming for the local areas. And one of the tried and true shows that all these different markets had were horror show hosts. So out in California, they had Vampira, and then they had Elvira, and in New York they had Zachary, and in Boston they had one. I think it was Simon Sanctorum. These were all over the country. Now in Chicago they had Svengoolie. Now Svengoolie is about the last one left standing, and he's still doing it in Chicago, and it's now on nationally on a channel called MeTV on Saturday nights, which I still watch.
Nice.
But when I was growing up, this is where I got my first sort of film school education into a particular genre. So on Svengoolie, I watched all the classic Universal monster movies, the Japanese giant monster movies, the Hammer horror films, the AIP drive-in movies. I saw them all on Svengoolie, and I just soaked it up like a sponge. And so this is what so around the same time as getting the Famous Monsters magazine and the Dracula model, and then becoming aware of Svengoolie and watching all these incredible films, this is where my love of film began. And that's what kind of got me started wanting to I didn't understand when I was 5, 6, 7 years old what a producer was, or what a director was, or what a screenwriter was. I just knew movies got made somehow in Hollywood, which was somewhere out there. And I just knew someday I was going to go there and make real movies. But in the meantime, I'm going to have fun making movies with my friends because it's fun.
Yeah, no, it's great. Do you remember, this is a tough question, but the first movie I should have said there's about like 23 shorts, something like
Something like that. Yeah, something like
23 in that range. The first one is called The Lady Giant, and I think your sister's in it. Do you know?
My sister is the Lady Giant.
She is the Lady Giant. What inspired that one? Do you remember anything in particular that inspired that one?
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, speaking of Svengoolie, I'm sure I had just come off seeing Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, or The Amazing Colossal Man, or one of those giant atomic movies, right? And I also had an erector set. So I was building little buildings with it. I also had Matchbox cars, and I just thought, these things all fit together. This would be a good little movie I could make right now. I remember we decided, let's make this movie right now. So I set up a little town with the erector set. I set up little cars, and the idea was, it was a very simple plot, of course. The Lady Giant was going to enter the town and stomp on it. That was pretty much the whole plot. But it was, and my sister's a few years younger than me. So if I was 6, she was 3, roughly, or if I was 7, she was 4, or, whatever roughly. And it was getting kind of cold, as it tends to get in the Midwest. So my mother insisted that my sister wear her winter coat, which is a big puffy winter coat, And I was absolutely furious, because obviously giants don't wear coats. And I had this big fight with my mother, and it was basically my very first battle with the studio. And of course, as we all know, the studio always wins. So when you see the movie, my sister is wearing her big puffy coat. But we still made it, and we still so that's the movie that kickstarted everything. That was the very first film I ever made.
I love that that's your first battle with the studio. What was your mom's take on the filmmaking in general and your passion for it, especially over time, but from the beginning and then on through?
I was always very lucky. My parents both were very supportive. We came, my sister and I came from a pretty artistic family. My grandmother was an artist. My mother wrote local children's television in Chicago and also local theater in Chicago. So everybody was pretty creative. And so when I expressed interest early on in wanting to make movies, everybody thought it was great and just was really supportive. And my dad gave me the family home movie camera to use to make them. And I don't know if they thought I was going to do it for a week or a month or a year, but I just kept going and going and going. I'm as excited about making movies now as I was then. I just have not ever burned out on the idea. I just love it. It's my calling. And I feel really lucky that I got a chance very early on to figure out what I love and what I want to do. And I just have focused only on that ever since.
Well, I just love that you got that support from your mom. I'm also curious about your grandmother's role. Like, she obviously was a fan. Can you talk about her role in this whole process?
Yeah, so my grandmother also fabulous and hilarious and very creative and very supportive. And so whenever I could, I would use her in the movies. So there's a movie in particular called Monster Barbecue. And my grandmother plays every monster in that movie. So I dressed her up as Dracula, werewolf, Hunchback of Notre Dame. I had all these cool masks, monster masks that I was collecting, and all these cool monster props that I would collect. And I always with the idea of I wanted to use them in my movies in some way or another. So I wrangled her to be all the monsters. It was fun. It was a lot of fun, and she was very, very supportive.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. I really like that one in
Thank you.
particular. So you said you were collecting these masks and props. Where would you get them? like, typically, was it just anywhere, flea markets? Where did they sort of pop up?
The main source was there was a mall outside of Chicago called Randhurst Mall. I think it's still there. And in Randhurst Mall, there was, and maybe there still is, there was a store called PJ's Trick Shop. And it was magic tricks and practical jokes. And it was also a head shop, which I didn't understand what that was at the time, but there was a section with black light posters and little contraptions that I had no idea what they were. I've later come to understand what they are. But there was also this whole section of monster masks. And they were very expensive. I mean, at the time, $40-ish, $45 each. I would save my money, and every number of months, I'd be able to save up enough to get another mask, and it was very fun. Also, too, I got a couple of masks. Occasionally, the family would go on a vacation to Disney World, and there was a magic shop in Disney World that had cool monster masks, too. And I remember buying a couple of masks on a couple of those trips. But I loved collecting those and using them in the movies.
I'm a big fan of masks in movies in general, and I think horror movies, for me, sometimes are made or broken by the masks.
Of
And I gotta
course.
say, your masks are like, because they're coming from like the late 70s, early 80s or whatever. It's just a different kind of thing. Like the molds were different or whatever. But there's some really good looking masks in there, like masks that I would say you could use in a professional film now, and I'd be like, that's a cool mask. So I dug that stuff.
I agree. It was a great. I mean, the masks they made in those days were really high quality. I remember when I was probably about 10 or 11, as a family vacation, we came out to LA, and I knew that Don Post Masks was, they used to advertise in the back of Famous Monsters and Fangoria and all these magazines. And so I contacted them. I wanted to see where the masks were made. So I remember we got a chance to go to the Don Post mask little place that they made these masks, and I was shocked. I thought it was going to be some big factory. It was just this little room in the back of some store that had nothing to do with monster masks, just like some kids, pouring latex into these molds, and it was really funny, but it was cool. It was neat to see where they were made.
That's awesome. I love that you were into that at such a young age. It totally makes sense. Everything makes sense. So many of your movies, especially I think more as you got into the high school, but I feel like early on even they incorporate animation and stop motion. And I was just curious, like why you thought you were drawn to that particular form and why it showed up so much.
Well, a big influence on me, in addition to monster movies and stuff, was Monty Python and Terry Gilliam, and his sort of cutout style of animation seemed very doable to me. Like you look at Disney animation or any kind of cell animation, it's a whole different Megillah, and I didn't really feel like I could get my fingers around that concept at that age. But cutting out photographs and cutting out the mouth, and there's something about that style that I always thought was really neat. And so that influenced me a lot. And then also too, there was a lot of there was a show on in Chicago called Image Union that would show short films made by local kids, and a bunch of them had animation in them, and I like claymation and stuff. And I thought, wow, that's so cool. How do they do that? And you'd read in Cinema Fantastique magazine or something about how you do it. And I remember I went and I bought the little trigger that you could just photograph one frame at a time, and I screwed it into the camera so I could animate. It was fun, and just to figure these things out on your own. And I also always loved just animated movies, period. I mean, I've always been I watched hours of cartoons a day, so I just was very, very drawn to animation.
Yeah, I totally get it. I'm the same way personally. But I do love that amongst all the monster movies, you also have these moments of, like you say, very much Terry Gilliam-esque, Monty Python cutout animation. I think that's just a nice other thing that you're doing. You just got a lot going on. It's really impressive.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure it's pretty, I think watching these movies, it's easy to see what my influences have been, monster movies, Monty Python, Mad Magazine. These are the things that I thought were fun as a kid, and I wanted to make movies like those things that influenced me. So
Yeah, no, it totally comes through. There's one in particular, I don't know again if you remember this, but there's one called I think it's called Lyclops.
I remember it well.
Okay, so it starts with like you sort of apologizing for it not being a feature, and then it turns into you sort of commenting on a family gathering. I'm just curious, like what happened? What is that about?
Lyclops, I had big plans for. It was going to be my Godzilla, right? And I had shot a bunch of cool shots. I had learned forced perspective, miniature photography in one of the magazines. I don't remember which magazine it was, but I learned about how if you put something close to the camera and then you have somebody in the distance, give them a specific eye line that looks like they're looking at what's in front of closer to the camera. It looks like there's a giant creature there. So I had all these cool images of this giant half lizard, half cyclops creature stomping around the neighborhood, but I lost most of that footage, unfortunately. And so the movie started out, I built this cool miniature. I had the mad scientist create the Lyclops. It was going to grow out of his control. I got the first few moments of the film shot, and then I shot all these great, moments with the forced perspective. And then I remember I lost all the forced perspective stuff. I don't remember what happened, but I got kind of disenchanted with the movie at that point, because to have to reshoot that all seemed daunting. I mean, it would have taken me an hour, but when you're a little kid, so instead I remember still putting the footage that did survive into my film festival reel, because a lot of the stuff that you see on the disc I had transferred to VHS at the time and called it the Adam Rifkin Film Festival, because there was a photomat shack in the parking lot of the mall near my house, and you could get photographs developed there, but you could also take your Super 8 home movies there and get them transferred to VHS. Now, I thought at that time VHS was the ultimate in state-of-the-art technology. And once things were on VHS, you didn't even need the film elements anymore. So a lot of my films got lost because of that. But the ones that did survive were, the pieces of Lyclops that you see in the movie. So anyway, in the Adam Rifkin Film Festival, the original one, the one that I had transferred in the Photomat Shack, the family holiday party came right after the Lyclops footage. So I just kept narrating through it as though it was all part of the same. But what you undoubtedly don't know is that in that footage of the family gathering, everybody that I'm saying, and here's cousin so-and-so, and here's uncle so-and-so, I'm giving all wrong information, which I thought at the time was very funny. Like I would say, this is Uncle Irv, but it was not, it was a different uncle. I guess when you're 10, you think certain things are funnier than you might think when you're older, but that's how that came about.
I just think it's hilarious. I love how it ended up, it's just because it's so random, but I'm just like, this is very entertaining.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, just like watching all these shorts, I found myself wanting to go back and look. Well, one thing I should say is that I watched your documentary. Is it Giuseppe Makes a Movie?
Giuseppe Makes a Movie, yes.
Yeah, and that was one of your actors, Giuseppe Andrews, I think.
Correct. That's right.
That was in Detroit Rock City. That I would say to people watching this, followed by that, and I hadn't seen that documentary, and that's obviously, for those who don't know, it's all about Giuseppe making his own films on video in sort of a trailer park that he lives in at the time, with the people that live there. It's really a moving and funny and very enjoyable documentary. So hats off to you for that. But I love doing those two things back to back. But the other thing I did was I'm a fan of yours. And so I went back and watched Detroit Rock City, The Chase, Dark Backward, which is one of my favorites of your films.
Thank you so much.
But especially Detroit Rock City and The Chase, I really felt like I could see a lot of that same kind of filmmaking, obviously in a much more polished professional way, but that same kind of energy. And I just really felt like you were still that kid. And I guess that's not really a question, is more a comment, but I really felt it, I got to say.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And listen, when I was making Detroit Rock City, one of the thrills of doing it was recreating the era, the 70s. And especially, like, I remember when I stepped onto the set of the basement at the beginning of the movie where they're practicing their band. And just that whole set felt so authentic. Like when I stepped into it, I felt like I was stepping back in time, and I felt like I was the kid making those movies again. It's funny you should say that, because I felt that while I was making that movie.
That's cool. I mean, and that set is great, and I love all the period stuff in it, and I enjoy that movie more and more each time I watch it.
Thank you.
Got such a great energy, and like I said, there's just a frenetic passion that really seems to line up. Is there anything else that you want to tell people about this, maybe that we haven't touched on, as a selling point for picking it up? Because I'm just about ready to give you back your time and say thank you for doing this.
No problem. I would say this, making movies at that time, having to shoot them on little cartridges of Super 8 film, each cartridge was 2 minutes of footage, and it was very expensive at the time. I mean, $5 for a cartridge of 2 minutes of film it was a lot when you're a kid. And I would have to save up in order to make these movies. If I had the technology now that is available, if I had it then, it would have just been mind-blowing to be able to shoot movies with your phone and edit them on an app and promote them on social media to the world, and you could upload them to YouTube to the entire world. It would have been so great. And I encourage anybody out there who loves movies to just go out there and start making them, because to me, there was nothing more fun when I was growing up than to make movies. And now the technology has really caught up to people's ambition, and you can do anything now with basically nothing. So I would say, if anything, watch this, take a little inspiration from a little inspiration from what's there, and just start making your own films. And the more films, the better, because the more you make, the better you'll get. And who knows, one of them might catch fire and change your life,
Yeah, that's really well said. I guess last thing I'll say before I let you go, you were talking about the film you're making now. real briefly, I know it's not necessarily finished, but do you want to talk about what that is and what it will potentially be so that people can maybe look for it when it's done?
Sure. Interestingly enough, along the same lines of, family, because obviously my mother, my grandmother, we're talking about my family. Um, I'm directing a Western called Last Train to Fortune. It stars Malcolm McDowell, Bernadette Peters, Mary Steenburgen, and James Paxton, who is the son of Bill Paxton. James is playing the role that Bill originally was going to play in this movie when we were going to make it several years ago. And
Wow.
what's interesting about it is that this movie was written by my mom.
Oh, that's amazing.
She wrote it 37 years ago, and we're finally making it now.
That's fantastic. Well, I wish you the best with it. And, I know these things take time, so it may be a while before it's finished, but I just want people to keep an eye out for it. Sorry, what's the title one more time?
It's called Last Train to Fortune, and
Last Train to
it's
Fortune.
all shot. It's on the camera. We're almost finished with the edit. Then's going to start the process of sound and visual effects and everything. So it'll be a little while before it's done, but do keep an eye out for it. Last Train to Fortune. So far, I think it's turning out really well.
That's great. I'm excited that you're doing a Western. That's really cool from
Thanks,
my
me
point of
too.
view. So
Thanks. I've always loved Westerns, so getting to do one is really neat.
fantastic. Again, thank you so much for your time, Adam. I really appreciate it. Everybody check out the Adam Rifkin Film Festival. You can get it at vinegarsyndrome.com exclusively through the partner label tab under Dekanalog. Highly recommended, highly enjoyable. Again, I'm a big fan of yours, Adam. So thank you again so much for doing this.
I can't thank you enough. I mean, I really appreciate it, and all the best. No, I'm very touched by your kind words. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. Okay, thanks everybody, and we'll talk to you very soon.